Father, we're thankful for the privilege of just getting together this morning, the fact that your mercies are new every morning, that we have a privilege to get in your word together, to spend time hearing from you, from your Spirit, as he tells us about your plan of redemption in your Son. We pray that as we consider your word in the book of Ruth, that we would be thankful for your relentless pursuit of working out your promises to send the seed of the woman who would be our Savior, the seed of Abraham, the son of David. We pray that we would continue to understand better your word, to rejoice in it, and to be thankful for you. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. So some of you weren't here last week, some of you were, but I want to just give a little bit of context why we're jumping to Ruth next. And you might say, well, we just finished Judges and Ruth is the next book in the Bible, so of course we're going there. That of course depends on the order of canon that you hold to. You say, well, we're Protestants, so we hold the Protestant order of canon. Well, as Protestants, we don't say that this particular order of the canon is the biblical order of the canon. It's the order that we have. So Ruth comes after Judges. If you go to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, you'll find, which happens 150 plus years before Christ comes around, and clearly both Jesus and the apostles refer to the Septuagint. Ruth comes right after Judges in that canon order. But if you look at the even earlier and later Hebrew order of the canon, in the Hebrew order of the canon, Ruth comes after Proverbs 31, or after the book of Proverbs, and lands in the wisdom literature. So when you listen to different biblical theologians, they argue over where do we put Ruth? And where do we tell the story of Ruth? And there are different ways to go about it. I don't think either order is incorrect. Some will argue that Ruth is really meant for the exilic Israel, in other words, Israel in exile and coming out of exile. That's why it's placed where it's placed in the wisdom literature, to remind Israel of what the Lord did in the period of the Judges to bring about the king, right? And that's where it best belongs, as this kind of story of reminder. And some argue, no, it goes best after Judges and before Samuel, because Ruth is set in the period of the Judges. That's where it's set. It's set in the period of the Judges, and it actually ties you to Samuel and the coming of King David. And so there are these debates. I've decided to put Ruth here because my primary goal is not for you to learn, and I wrestled over this, but my primary goal is not for you to learn necessarily how Ruth may be used in the wisdom literature, though I think that's a worthwhile conversation. How Ruth is used in the life of Israel. Of the feasts that they have each year, Ruth would be one of the liturgical readings of the feast. Song of Solomon's a liturgical reading of a feast. Actually, Song of Solomon, interestingly enough, was the liturgical reading at Passover, which is interesting. And Ruth was a liturgical reading. But my primary concern isn't for you to learn that. My primary concern is for you to learn the storyline of the Bible. And because that's my focus, is the storyline, I've decided to put Ruth between Judges and Samuel, where we have it in our Bibles, because of the fact that it ties us to the period of Judges and presses us into Samuel. You guys follow me on that? And develops this theme of this coming king. So that's why we've put her there. Like I said, if you look at Ruth 1:1, in the day when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. I just want you to stop there and understand, in the days when the judges ruled. So what period are we in? The period of Judges. So that means this book goes somewhere, as this story, if you will, goes somewhere in the story of the period of the Judges. Okay? If you were to take this story, you would insert it somewhere in Judges. Now, I don't exactly know where, but it goes somewhere in that story. Okay? Historically. This is not just a nice story that's told for people's benefit. This is history. This happened. That's the Bible's assertion. Okay? In the day when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. So we get this introduction. This is happening in the period of the Judges, and there's a famine in the land, and there's this man who leaves Bethlehem in Judah and heads to Moab. Now, and takes his wife and his 2 sons. Now, the period of the Judges, we need to remember the character of that period to understand what the author is telling us right off the get-go. Because the author is actually telling us something important right in verse 1. But look at verse 25 of Judges 21, which is the page before. Judges 21, 25. I mean, it should almost appear right there before 1:1 of Ruth. In those days, that's the period of the Judges, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. If you remember from chapter 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 of the book of Judges, there's this constant emphasis on the fact that there was no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And we have a problem because we have no king. And so Israel has descended into moral and spiritual anarchy. That's what's happened. As a nation, as a people, they have descended into moral and spiritual anarchy. Right? And so this is a huge problem for Israel, that there is no king and everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. And they've descended in moral spiritual anarchy to the point that they become compared to Sodom. If you guys remember from the end of Judges. They're a mess. So we get this picture that this is where Ruth is taking place. If you remember, in the book of Judges, where do they leave us? What location are they at when Judges leaves us? There's emphasis on 2 areas at the end of Judges. Anybody remember? One is where the tabernacle is. What city? Where is that? Shiloh. And the other is, anybody remember? The hills of Ephraim. Thank you. So, Brian, you did pay attention. Sorry, I just gave Brian a hard time earlier about not knowing why we're doing the book of Ruth now. So, all right, so the hills of Ephraim, right, is where most of the action in the last several chapters of the book of Judges takes place, and they end us in Shiloh. But here we pick up in Bethlehem in Judah. And so what tribe in the book of Ruth are we dealing with? What tribe? What's that? Okay, nope. We're dealing with Judah, the tribe of Judah. Okay? That's why they're in Bethlehem in Judah, right? Judah's area is the tribe of Judah that we're dealing with. The tribe of Judah is who we're dealing with. That's who okay? That becomes important. Can anybody tell me why? Okay, the Messiah comes out of Judah. Well, let's step before the Messiah. Okay, historically in coming. Obviously, the Messiah, the promise of the Messiah comes before the promise of this person. But in historical occurrence, let's step before the Messiah. Who comes from Judah? King David. Okay? And that promise happens in Genesis, at the end of Genesis, right? When Judah's blessed, he's told that the scepter shall not depart from Judah. And when we come into, for example, the end of Exodus, into Leviticus, etc., where is Judah and Numbers? Where is Judah placed with regard to the tabernacle? The 12 tribes are surrounding the tabernacle. Where is Judah? Yeah, he's in the front of these. So as the tabernacle travels, who's sort of the military front first? Judah. Okay, and the king will come from Judah. Judah's also the first tribe given a land inheritance. Okay, and so we've landed ourselves not only in the period of the Judges, but in a different area than where Judges leaves off. Judges leaves off at the hills of Ephraim, and if you will, in Shiloh, most specifically. Ruth picks us up in the period of the Judges, but it picks us up in the tribe of Judah. Okay? And that ought to tip you off right away. We're in the period of Judges, and what is there lacking in Israel? There was no what in Israel? King. And so Israel's descended into moral and spiritual anarchy. So when we pick up this book in the period of the Judges and we're at Judah, what do you think the emphasis that's coming is? Because what comes from Judah? King. What is there lacking in Israel? A king. Okay, you guys following that? I'm not asking you trick questions. These are just straight up. I know it's 6 o'clock in the morning, but still. the king is coming from Judah, and that's what's lacking in Israel. All right, so let me give you a basic outline. This isn't mine. This is a guy, his last name is like Yao, Y-E-O. I don't even know how to pronounce it. So is his last name. Do anybody know how to pronounce it? Anybody know? Huh? Yao or something? I don't know. Anyway, it's he does quite a good job with the book of Ruth. I liked his outline, so I'm ripping it off just so I don't take credit. But here's the outline that he gave us for this book. He said there's a prologue in Ruth 1 through 5, which we're going to look at, which talks about disobedience in the royal line. Now, why can he call everything, by the way, if you notice the royal line, why does he name everything under the royal line? How can he do that? Because what tribe are we talking about? Judah. What comes from Judah? The king. Therefore, it's the royal, Judah's, whatever happens in Judah's tribe is happening in the royal line. You guys follow that? Okay? So he starts off with disobedience in the royal line, and then he, in Ruth 1 through 5, then he moves through the punishment and predicament for the royal line, right? Which comes through the rest of chapter 1. The hope of a kinsman redeemer for the royal line, chapter 2. The unexpected complication for the royal line, chapter 3. The redemption of the royal line in the first, or the large section, 2/3 of chapter 4. And then this epilogue, the ancestry of the royal line. So I want to look at it in that way, in those 6 parts, all of which we should cover this morning. Okay, so it's a short book, so it shouldn't take us too long. But let's start with the prologue, verse 1 through 5, or chapter 1 through 5, sorry. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died. So the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Okay, let's look at this for a minute. If we notice how this starts, I put this up here, the disobedience to the royal line. If you look at verse 1, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a what? Famine in the land. Now, why would a famine come? What does that key us off to? There's a famine in the land. This is a land flowing with milk and honey. This is the promised land where God's people are blessed. And there's a famine there. What does that key us off to? Judgment. Because we're told over and over again in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they're given these warnings of judgment if they're in sin. Now, in the period of the judges, are they known to be in a lot of sin? Yes, there was no king, so what are they doing? Whatever's right in their own eyes. And so, likely, this is tipping us off to a kind of judgment that's happening. And notice that famine is happening in Bethlehem, which is ironic, because Bethlehem's name it means the house of bread. So there is a famine in the house of bread, right? And there's a bit of an irony there. In Judah, this is pointing us to the royal line, this tribe that's there. And what happens? A man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Let me ask you a question. Is leaving the land okay? There's a famine in the land. If you're an Israelite, what ought you to be doing? Repenting. Praying for God to bless the land again, right? And the people. Are you supposed to be bailing and going to live in a pagan nation? No, right? But that's what this guy does. He goes to the country of Moab. Now remember who Moab is. To leave the land and head to Moab, to remain, is akin to denying God's covenant promise. That's what I'm going to argue. That's the argument I'm making. This is akin. Elimelech is doing something akin to denying God's covenant promise. I'm not going to trust him to provide in the land. I'm going to go find my own provision elsewhere. And so he bails. Now, there are some scholars who say, well, this isn't really a problem. He's not really in sin. It never tells us he's in sin. I think part of the problem with that argument is that we misread the Old Testament if we're looking for like little placards every time someone sins to tell us they're in sin. Okay? For example, when Abraham goes into Hagar, there's no announcement, Abraham sins here. Is Abraham in sin there? Absolutely. I mean, you can go back to Genesis 2. How many wives is a man supposed to have? One. Same book, okay? We already know that. All right? So it doesn't have to announce to you in sin. It shows you, by the way. Does it go well for Abraham when he ends up with Hagar and Sarah? No, right? It doesn't go well for him or his kids. When Jacob takes a couple wives and some concubines, does it go well for him? No. Is it announced? Jacob's in sin here. No, does it have to? It's a little bit sad. I mean, you guys read novels or you go to movies, right? Every time a character does something dumb, unwise, or sinful in a movie, the movie doesn't stop and say, by the way, this was dumb and unwise. It shows you that because of the course of the story. You guys follow me on that? It shows you the outcome of it. Sometimes we have to read a narrative understanding that it's a narrative. It doesn't have to stop and announce the sin every time it's happening. You can just see it in front of you, right? And then you go, this is dumb. Now, what's the context for knowing this is a sin? Genesis chapter 19. I just want you to remember the history of the Moabites, okay? So where do they come from? Genesis chapter 19. I'm not going to read this whole section, but it's about Lot and his daughters. Anybody remember that? Okay? And what ends up happening? Lot gets drunk and does what? Sleeps with his daughters. Is that okay biblically? No. Okay? It doesn't have to announce to you it's not okay. It is not okay. And who comes from one of his daughters, verse 37, the firstborn daughter of Genesis 19, bore a son and called his name what? Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. So, how do the Moabites come along? How does their people group come along? Through what? Through the incestual relationship of Lot and his daughter. That's not a good beginning for your people group. Okay? It's not a good beginning. Right? So that's how they come along. Now let's continue to move forward. If you remember in Numbers 22, as the people of Israel have come into the land of Moab, as they're on their way, Moab is east of the Jordan, right? They're on their way to the Promised Land. They come into the area of Moab. Then the people, if you look at Numbers 22, verse 1, then the people of Israel set out and camped in the plains of Moab beyond the Jordan at Jericho. And Balak, the son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites, and Moab was in great dread of the people because they were many. Moab was overcome with fear of the people. And Moab said to the elders of Midian, this horde will now lick up all that's around us as the ox licks up the grass of the field. So Balak, the son of Zippor, who was king of Moab at the time, sent messengers to Balaam, the son of Peor. Okay, and now what does he ask Balaam to do? Remember? He wants Balaam to curse Israel. Okay? Now, so, how do we first learn about Moab? They are coming from the offspring of the ancestral relationship between Lot and one of his daughters, his firstborn daughter. Now, what do we next really learn about the Moabites? When Israel comes into the land, what does Israel want to do to them? Does Israel stop and go, oh, these are the people of God. This is Abraham's descendants. Remember Abraham? He's the one who saved our father Lot. Right? Is that what happens? They say, uh-oh, we better get a pagan priest and bring him in here to curse God's people. Okay? So that's the next introduction you get to the Moabites. Is that good? No, still bad. Numbers 25. Balaam can't curse the can't curse Israel on behalf of the Moabites, though he wants to. God won't let him. He ends up continuing blessing Israel, right? And so now they take another tack. Balaam convinces them of a better way to bring down Israel. Verse 25, or chapter 25, verse 1. While Israel lived in Shittim, the people began to whore with the daughters of Moab. These invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And then there's this falling of thousands of people. So Balaam had actually talked them into it and said, here's what you do, Balak. You get your daughters to lay with their men, and their men are anxious to lay with your daughters, and then they will follow after your gods. Okay, now Israel was specifically warned not to lay with pagan women, right? The men were told, don't go building those kinds of relationships with pagan women, because you'll end up doing what? Worshiping their gods. So what happens? They lay with the pagan women, and they worship their gods, and there's a falling of thousands of them in Moab. Okay? So you have Moabite women in idolatry. You have the Moabite desire to curse Israel. You have Moabites coming from the incestual relationship of Lot and his daughter. Now look at Judges chapter 3. Judges chapter 3. So just go forward to the book of Judges. We'll give you a little bit more context right in the historical period that Ruth is taking place. In other words, in the period of the Judges, a little bit more context on the Moabites. Look at chapter 3 and verse 12. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Verse 14, and the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. So, the Moabites enslaved Israel for 18 years. All right? Under an evil king. Now, here comes the question. When you open the book of Ruth, and you're an Israelite, and you have all this historical context, and you read there's a famine in the land during the period of the Judges. Moral and spiritual anarchy, God's judgment, right? Famine. In Bethlehem, the house of Judah, right? Or the tribe of Judah in Bethlehem, the house of bread. Okay, this is happening. Tribe of Judah, Bethlehem, there's a famine. And a man takes his family, rather than repenting, a man takes his family and goes to Moab to live there. What are you hearing? Right? To live among the Moabites. Are you hearing anything good at this point? Okay. Now look what happens next. Takes his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of the 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Okay, now, notice the end of verse 2. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. It's not just they sojourned there for a short bit, went over there to get some food and came back. They went there and they moved in, they settled. All right? They're not staying in God's promised land. They're staying among the Moabites. And even worse, Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons, probably indicating a kind of judgment, the death of the husband. Okay? And notice what the 2 sons do, verse 4. These 2 sons took what? Moabite wives. Is that permitted for Israel? No. So they go and take Moabite wives. The sin is compiling. You guys follow me here? Not only have they gone to the land and not trusted God's covenant promises and repented, etc., but now they've moved their family in among the pagans, remained there, and taken Moabite wives. Now look what it says. They lived there about 10 years. And he names the 2, Orpah and Ruth, which we'll get to. They lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died. Okay? Now both of the sons die. So this woman has lost her husband and 2 sons. Things are not going well with her. Seems to indicate a kind of judgment on the family. Now notice this. So that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. What's interesting is, she's left without her 2 sons and her husband. What else do you notice she doesn't have? She has daughters-in-law, 2 daughters-in-law, but what does she not have? Any grandkids. She has no grandsons, right? No grandchildren at all. How long were her 2 sons married to these 2 women? about 10 years, didn't produce any children. What does that indicate to you? Barrenness tends to indicate judgment, doesn't it? So we're picking up these narrative clues we're going to see continuing through the story. The barrenness of the wives, 10 years and no children. The death of the men leaves us this impression of judgment that's coming. And notice this disobedience and judgment's being shown in the royal line. Now Naomi's going to hint at the fact that she knows there's a kind of judgment here. In a minute, we'll look at that. But let's look next at this next section, the punishment and predicament for the royal line. Verse 6 through 22. Notice verse 6. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. Notice she went away, and while she's living in Moab, what does the Lord come to do in Bethlehem? He visits Bethlehem and does what? Visits Judah and gives them what? Food. Gives them bread. Okay, what should her family have done? Waited for the Lord to deliver them and bring them bread, but they didn't. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." So Bethlehem is now replenished with bread. The house of bread is now full of bread. And she's wanting to return. And how does she refer to herself? She tells these 2 women, "I want the Lord to deal kindly with you," which, by the way, I think is a way of her saying, "I hope you find husbands and have children." Okay? Because to be without husbands in that world is not a safe nor good place for a woman, nor without children is bad, especially without sons. And so she says, "I want the Lord to deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with" who? The dead and with me. Who's she grouping herself together with? Her family. And what's her family? Yeah, so what's their state? They're dead. Okay? She's really grouping herself along with the dead. Here's what she's doing. She's basically calling herself one of the dead, if you will. She recognizes that she's empty, she's without, she's dead, and she's bitter about it. Let's just read through verse 14, and then we'll pick up 19 through 21 and all in between. But look at what she says, verse 9. "The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." In other words, she wants them to find what? Husband, because their husbands have died. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands?" In other words, I can't produce any new sons that you're going to wait around for them to grow up and you can marry them. Okay? So it's not going to happen. She'll say that. Turn back, verse 12. "Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Okay? It's interesting language in the names too. Orpah means that your neck turns, your head turns, at the neck. So Orpah's saying, "I'm going to give you a kiss. I'm out of here," right? Her neck is turning. She's going to go back to the people. But what has Naomi said about herself? It's exceedingly what for her? Bitter for her. Because the hand of the Lord has done what? Gone out against her. Okay? So does Naomi recognize judgment has come to her household? She does. That's why I say, even if you're not understanding the narrative clues you're being given in the first 5 verses, here you basically have a placard announcing to you what the situation is. Right? The Lord has come against her in judgment, if you will. Now, it's interesting because Orpah's ready to take off, but what does it say about Ruth? Ruth did what? Clung to her, right? And Ruth is actually going to covenant with her, and we're getting a key to that covenant coming. But skip verse 15 through 18 and look down to verse 19 through 21 just to understand Naomi's plight. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi." Okay, Naomi means pleasant. Okay? Don't call me pleasant. Call me Mara. And what does Mara mean? Bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. Now, she's not saying she's bitter against the Lord. You guys follow that? She's saying the Lord is, if you will, bitter against her, right? Or dealt with her bitterly. In other words, she's not complaining here. She's basically saying, I've been judged. We might say she's complaining in as much as she doesn't like her situation, but you understand, she's recognizing the Lord's judgment is against her. Okay? And look at how she sums that up in verse 21. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Now, this is a fascinating statement. She went away full, but the Lord has brought her back empty. Okay? She went away with a husband and 2 sons. She's come back with none of that. Right? She went away from a famine full and returned to a house of bread full of bread, empty. Isn't that interesting? Famine is gone in the land, but she's returned empty. It's a fascinating contrast between Judah and her. If you will, the people who stuck it out in Judah seem to have repented, and the Lord has brought them this blessing of harvest, and now they're full of bread. But Naomi's family, who bailed, has returned empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord, verse 21, I went away full and the Lord brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, etc., etc. Okay. So Naomi recognizes she is empty and dead and bitter, and she decides to return home. Okay? And she announces that. Now Ruth covenants to follow after Naomi and her God. So again, look at verse 16. I read verse 15. Or actually, we'll start with verse 15. And Ruth clings to her into verse 14 and verse 15. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people." In other words, Orpah went back to her people, the Moabites, and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Okay? That means go back to your people and to your gods. At least you can find a husband there. Okay? I can't have any more sons. Verse 16, but Ruth said to her, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. From where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge." These are vows. Are you guys picking that up? She's clinging to her and she's making vows to her. Where you go, I'll go. Where you lodge, I'll lodge. It's, when you make a covenant, you make vows, don't you? You guys know that? If you're married, you stood up and you made vows, right? Because you're establishing a covenant. So you give vows. Now she's going to do a maledictory oath. In other words, she's going to confirm her covenant with an oath, right? We don't tend to do this at weddings, right? We'll say till death do us part. That's about the closest we get to a maledictory oath. We don't say, if I bail on this marriage, may God bring curses upon my head or something, or slit my throat or whatever, right? We don't bring maledictory oaths upon ourselves. Maybe we should. But here's what she does. After she goes, "Your people shall be my people and your God my God." Okay, notice these vows she's making, okay? Vows. Now, here comes the oath. Right after a couple more vows. "Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." Okay, maledictory oath. We get close, we say in our covenant, "till death do us part," but we don't say, "I hope the Lord rains curses down on my head if I leave you before death." Right? That's what she's doing here in the covenant. That's a proper, if you will, Old Testament covenant. She gives these vows, and then she puts a maledictory oath to confirm it. Right? So that's what she's doing. Now, her vow is to follow Naomi all the way to the grave, right? I'll go with you to the land. I'll stay with you. I'll stay by your side. Basically, I'll share in this emptiness with you. And what will I do? I will cling to you and your people. Your people shall be my people. And what? Your God, Naomi, shall be my God. Okay? You might call this the place in which Ruth announces her conversion to Israel's God and Israel's people, right? And when, verse 18, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. And so Ruth comes with Naomi. Ruth covenants to follow Naomi and to follow the covenant Lord. All right, let's go to the next slide. The hope of a kinsman redeemer for the royal line, chapter 2. Look at verse 1. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's. Notice that phrase, a relative of her husband's. That's not, the narrator's not throwing that in there for no reason. Okay? Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Okay, again, notice the repetition. A relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the what? The clan of Elimelech. Do we already know, there's a kind of intentional intensification, if you will, about the relationship. She has this man, there's this man who is a relative of her husband's. He's from the clan of her husband. You follow? Elimelech's her husband. So there's this emphasis. The narrator wants you to pick right up on the fact there's this man who's related to Naomi. That's going to matter to the story. Okay? And his name is what? Boaz. And what does the specific language say of him? He's a what? What kind of man is he? He's a worthy man. Now we're going to read about Boaz in just a second. But the reason we know Boaz is a worthy man is because Boaz is the kind of man who follows the Lord. And we're going to see that in this story. I'll give you a hint at it. Just look at verse 4. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, those are the people out reaping in the field, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. In other words, Boaz is going to his field. He's an owner of this field. He sees the reaper in his field, and what's he doing? He's blessing these people, right? He's this kind of, if you will, owner, employer who blesses the people who work with him. He is just being held up here right at the beginning. The picture is he shows up, he sees his employees, if you will, his workers, and what does he want to do? He wants to bless them, right? This is a worthy man. That's what we're getting at here. And he wants to bless them under the Lord. In other words, he's trusting the Lord, right? Okay, Ruth is going to run into this man, Boaz, all right? And I want to look at this story from really verse 1 through 4. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, notice that reference. It said she's the Moabite more than once, and it's going to say it more than once. Why? What's the emphasis? If she's a Moabite, what is she? She's a Gentile. She's a foreigner. Okay? Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. In other words, I want to find a man I can glean in his field, and I'll find favor in his sight. Okay? Now, gleaning is typical practice in Israel. What happens is the outer edge of the fields of your crops, you were to leave unharvested so that the poor could go in there and harvest and eat from them. So you could do, if you will, the interior, but that's the way the poor ate, is that it was mandatory, right? That you left that unharvested so they could go in and glean. It was a way to provide for the poor so that people wouldn't go hungry, okay? And so Boaz is a quite generous man when it comes to allowing the poor or the needy to glean from his field. Part of the reason he's a worthy man. He cares about the poor and the needy. You'll see that in this passage. And he cares about protecting the vulnerable, or women, in this particular passage. You'll see that with him. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened, the way this is in Hebrew, it's like she happened to happen upon. You know, the idea that it's wanting to emphasize that this isn't really just happenstance. That if you will, the invisible hand of the Lord is behind her arriving at Boaz's field. Okay? She happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who notice that phrase? What does it say again? Who was of the clan of Elimelech. You notice the narrator's going out of his way to emphasize that idea. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Now Boaz is going to bless Ruth and Naomi, even though, pick this up, Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth is a foreigner. Notice the language, verse 5. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" So he takes notice of Ruth, right? Takes notice of her. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab," in case you're not picking up on what they're trying to put down here, right? The narrator is being very intentional, right? Sometimes you have to slow down and read and pay attention to how much something's getting emphasized. So she said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. What's the emphasis there? What's that? She's a hard worker. And we know at this point she's gathering a lot of food for whose sake, largely? Naomi, right? She's diligently working. Then Boaz said to Ruth, Listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women." In other words, don't go gleaning in another man's field, right? Just glean in mine, okay? You understand what's happening here. He's like, this woman's a hard worker. Check her out, okay? I'm going to have her glean here, right? So he does. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? In other words, I already went and told all the other young men, hands off of this girl. And when you were thirsty, and by the way, that's for her safety. That's not like some kind of a sexually charged statement. He's trying to protect her. "And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a" what? Foreigner. Now, she went out looking for a field where she might find favor in the guy's eyes, right? And she's found favor in his eyes. And here she bows down and asks him, "Why have I? Since I'm a" what? A foreigner. Because she's from where? Moab. Because she's a Moabite, a foreigner. Okay, it's just a constant emphasis, isn't it? All right. Now Boaz is going to explain to Ruth that Ruth is faithful to the covenant Lord, right? And he will be faithful to her. Look at verse 11. But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." In other words, he's recognizing something about Ruth as a person, isn't he? She's a hard worker, and she is loyal to her mother-in-law. She's taking care of her, right? Even though her husband's died, etc. And he's gone to a foreign land with her. Look what he says. "The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Now that is not, by the way, an incidental kind of comment. She's taken refuge under the wings of the Lord. Okay? Now you go back to Exodus 19, for example, and Israel is under the wings of this Lord who is, you guys remember that passage? Okay? He carries them, right? Like his own, as an eagle carries. You guys don't remember that? Okay. Thank you. Okay? Exodus 19:4, I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. You've put yourself under my care and protection. That's what he's saying to Ruth. You've put yourself under the Lord's care and protection. You've sought refuge in him. Okay? You've sought redemption, if you will, in him, just like he redeemed Israel. Now, by the way, this language comes up again in Isaiah. It gets wildly abused and is usually used by Christian schools for their team verse, right, about being carried on eagle's wings, and they all name themselves eagles. The one that my kids go to did. And they use this theme verse anyway, but we misunderstand the covenantal nature of this, but and what's happening. But under whose wings you've come to take refuge. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. In other words, let her go glean from my crop, not just what I leave for the poor, but let her go glean from my own crop. And also pull out some from the bundles for her, and leave it for her to glean, and do not rebuke her. Let's take some of the stuff you've already bundled together and give it to her. Right? You understand what Boaz is doing here, right? He's taking care of Ruth very intentionally. So she gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. That's about 30 to 50 pounds, just so you know. Okay? She beats that out. And verse 18, and she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you, right? So, because look at how much you've brought back. Blessed be that guy. And Naomi seems to recognize some man has taken notice of you, so who is it, right? So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Remember, she thinks of herself as the dead, right? Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours. Notice that comes up again. One of our what? One of our redeemers. Okay, or kinsman redeemers. Okay, in other words, what was the law in Israel was that when you as a man died and left your wife and land, there was no way for the women to, if you will, own and produce on that land and pass that land down to the family. What they could do is sell the land in order to get money to provide for themselves. Okay? They could do that. But even then, that was they really needed this kinsman redeemer to come along. So one of the men in the family, generally the closest relative, male relative, would claim the land and would claim the woman, if there was one, so that they could keep the possession of the inheritance in the family. The idea was that we don't want Elimelech's family to lose his inheritance. So we produce sons for Elimelech, they can keep the inheritance. Now the women could sell the land, and then it could be the land that was sold to pay their bills could be later redeemed for Elimelech's family. But if someone doesn't marry one of these women, i.e. in this case, Ruth or Naomi, and Naomi's probably too old for childbearing, so somebody doesn't marry Ruth and produce a child and redeem her, does Elimelech's family get an inheritance? No, because there are no what? No sons, and there are no daughters either. Okay, if you remember, there is a story of a tribe whose father had died, and so the daughters split up the inheritance. You guys remember that, okay? So it's not like that isn't a possibility, but the issue is there's neither. There's no way for them to pass this land on to the family. So a kinsman redeemer comes and, if you will, buys the family land and takes the woman as a wife, and then produces children with that woman so that that family then has the inheritance. Okay? And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they've finished all my harvest. And in other words, I think he kind of likes me, right? He's paying attention. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young men, lest in another field you be what? Assaulted. So Boaz is protecting her. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. All right, so Boaz is blessing his family. Now, the unexpected complication for the royal line. Naomi is going to plot to see if Boaz wants to be the kinsman redeemer of Ruth and her family. So Naomi's going to get ahead of herself a little bit, but she thinks Boaz has been kind to us. He's a member of our family. Let's go find out, Ruth, he's been paying attention to you. Let's go find out if he wants to be the kinsman redeemer. So chapter 3, verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? In other words, I want you to have rest, which rest for her is to have what? What does she need to have rest? As a single woman, widow, what does she need? Husband. Okay? That it may be well with you. Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Okay, so he'd go winnow the barley, right? Okay, separating wheat chaff, etc., on the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on a cloak, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say, I will do. Okay, so basically take a shower, right? Get yourself all gussied up, put on the perfume, get yourself looking good, and then go tonight, and after he's done on the threshing floor, what's going to happen is it's going to be late, it's going to be dark, he's going to have eaten, he's going to have had his alcohol for the night, if you will, and he's going to lay down to go to sleep. He's going to put a blanket over himself, right, a covering. So what I want you to do is go in, once he's laid down and sort of done with his eating and drinking, and he's laying down under that cover, and go uncover his legs, his feet, and lay down at his feet, and he'll tell you what to do. Okay? Now, it sounds pretty illicit, doesn't it? And there are scholars that argue over whether Naomi's suggesting that Ruth sort of seduce Boaz. I'm not sure we can take it as far as to say it's illicit. Though he certainly, to uncover his legs, certainly would potentially point at the fact that she's not far removed from other things, okay? And I can see why people might take this as something illicit. I don't think it is illicit, because to be covered with the corner of a garment is later used in Ezekiel to talk about the Lord covering his bride with the cover of a garment, okay? So it seems to be referencing the idea to be covered with this corner of a garment, seems to be referencing this idea that you're coming under their protection and care and redemption, if you will. You're offering or asking to be redeemed and cared for and covered. You guys follow me on that? Okay, I think is what's actually happening. But it could look illicit for sure. So, but I think that's what she's asking for, is this kinsman redeemer. You can go to Ezekiel and see that kind of language more. So Boaz, and the reason I don't think it's ultimately illicit is because she's going to be called a worthy woman. Look at verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet, and probably his legs in the Hebrew there, and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. That'd startle most people. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you're a redeemer." Now, I want to ask you a question. Remember the language, spread your wings, already in this book? You do? Who was spreading wings before? What was that about? Where did that language come from? Yeah. Ruth had taken refuge under the wings of the Lord. Okay? So what's she seeming to be saying by saying, spread your wings over your servant? Covering herself with this covering that he has. What's she saying? That's why I said Ezekiel, right? You know, you see this kind of language about God and his bride. He covers his bride with the corner of his garment. He if you look at Exodus 19:4, you're under his wings. He's your refuge, your redeemer. You guys follow that language? She seems to be saying, I want you to be my refuge, my rest, my redeemer. In other words, she's wanting him to be the kinsman redeemer. All right? She's not saying spread your wings over your servant as some kind of illicit sexual talk, okay? This isn't like, pillow talk or something. This is a covenant she's asking for your redeemer. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. Now, that would be a strange thing to say to somebody who's offering to, you guys got it. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you've not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. In other words, you could have gone after younger guys. Boaz is saying, I'm kind of old. You didn't go after younger guys. He's flattered. Here this young woman has come after an old man, right? And asked to be redeemed by him, and he's liking this, okay? And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a what? A worthy woman. Chapter 2, verse 1, what is Boaz? A worthy man. What's interesting here is it seems the narrator is at pains to tell you, in the period of the judges, you have this worthy woman and this worthy man. In the period of a people who are in moral and spiritual apostasy, you have this worthy woman and this worthy man who've been essentially set aside by the Lord in the tribe of who? Judah. One's a foreigner, though. Right? So that comes up. And now it is true, verse 12, that I'm a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Here comes the complication. There's a relative more closely related to you than I. There is another man who could be the redeemer. And he has first right of refusal. You guys follow? Okay? Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. In other words, just go ahead and sleep there until morning. Different view of marriage than we have. Just so, side note, it's not a very, very romantic proposal. If the other guy will marry you, great. But if he won't, then I will, okay? So, all right. And he said, verse 14. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. In other words, he doesn't want her to be seen as doing something illicit, because she's not doing something illicit, so he doesn't want her to be misrepresented. I mean, this guy's a worthy guy. He is a decent guy, right? So he doesn't want her to be seen that way. And he said, verse 15, bring the garment you were wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. So he gave her a bunch more food, right, to take back to Naomi. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. How did Naomi come back to Judah, to Israel? Empty-handed. What's Boaz making sure Naomi no longer is? Empty-handed. It's a kinsman redeemer. You're going to go back to her so she's full. You hear what's starting to happen in the story? And then she replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn, verse 18, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. In other words, he's going to go take care of this today. Now, so let's look at, so there's a closer relative. Ruth returns home full. Okay, now let's look at chapter 4 briefly. The redemption of the royal line, verse 1. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the Redeemer of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, turn aside, friend, sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. It's a very interesting narration. It's like the one guy that Boaz is looking for just happens to walk by, right? This Redeemer. And so Boaz is like, let's talk. And he turned aside and sat down, verse 2. And he took the 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. In other words, you go buy it so it is kept in the family. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And what does he say? And he said, the nearest Redeemer said, I will redeem it. Right? He wants the land. I'll buy it. Okay? Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite. Notice that emphasis again. The widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Well, at first he thinks, it's land to buy. Who's going to benefit from me buying this land? My sons. But if I buy the land, and i.e. redeem it, and I have to marry that woman and give her children, then who's going to benefit from my expenditure of my money? Elimelech's family, her sons, right? Not my sons. And so, well, can't redeem it. Now I can't afford it anymore. When it was going to benefit my sons, I could afford it, but I can't afford it now that it's not. You guys follow that? Okay, it's going to benefit hers if I give her sons, so he's out. Notice, by the way, this man is never named. It's fascinating in a book that's so important to name everybody. Mahlon, Chilion, Elimelech, Ruth, Naomi, Boaz. Where the names are so important, this man remains nameless. By the way, he could have been Ruth's kinsman redeemer. And from him could have come whom? The king and the Messiah. But he didn't step up to the plate, and he just remains unnamed, I think intentionally so. Verse 5, then Boaz said, the day you buy the field... Oh, here, I read that. Verse 7, now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. In other words, so in front of the elders, one man needs to draw off his sandal and give it to the other man. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also, verse 10, Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon. Notice, it just keeps referencing her being a Moabite, doesn't it? The widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers, and from the gate of his native place you are witnesses to this day. Okay? So, Boaz is going to be Ruth, and then therefore Naomi's kinsman redeemer, right? Now, Ruth receives a canonically significant blessing. When I say canonically significant to the canon of the story, let's look at what it says. Verse 11. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord, Yahweh, make the woman, that's Ruth, who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. Okay? Rachel and Leah, who comes from them? All the 12 tribes, right? Now you could say, well, it does some come from the concubines, but they're Rachel and Leah's concubines. You follow? So the 12 tribes of Israel have come from Jacob's offspring through Rachel and Leah. And he's saying, may the Lord make the woman come into your house like them. In other words, that something great for the nation is coming through this, isn't it? Not just she's going to have sons, but she's going to have sons that matter to Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah, and be renowned in Bethlehem. Okay? Notice that. Boaz and Ruth are going to be renowned in Bethlehem. Who's going to come from Bethlehem? Well, and who comes before that? David. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. Okay? You guys remember the story of Perez and Tamar. Okay? Perez comes from the kind of illicit situation between Tamar and Judah. You guys remember that? But this is the line of Judah. Perez is in the line of the king. Okay, now, we have this kind of significant blessing that comes. And now the Lord will bless Ruth with a son. And frankly, Naomi. This son's going to reverse the fortunes of Naomi ultimately. Look at verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her. And the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Notice the emphasis. 10 years with her last husband, what did she not have? Kids. Now what happens? Yeah, he goes into her, the Lord gives her conception. And not just conception, but a son. Right? Then the women said to Naomi, check this out, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life." What did she say of herself? She was what? Really among the who? The dead. He shall be a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. You were empty, now he's going to nourish you. You were dead, he's going to give you life. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. See, Ruth is more to her than... Think about what a startling statement that is. Your Moabite foreigner daughter-in-law is more to you than 7 sons. Why? Because she's giving you this one son. She loves you, she's committed to you, she's brought redemption to your land, and now she's giving this one son. And this one son is big time important to Israel. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. Notice everything has changed for Naomi. She left, if you will, as part of a disobedient family, lost everything, came back empty-handed with no male offspring in her family. And now the book, as it's wrapping up, she's got a baby in her lap who's her grandson, right? And notice, and the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Guys, that's not incidental. It's not just thrown in there. Like, it'd be cute if we ended this just by saying who Obed was, right? He's the grandfather of David. This is intentional. The Lord blesses Ruth with a son who reverses the fortunes of Naomi, and who? Israel. David is who? Who is he? The king. What does Israel lack in the period of Judges? King. Now he's coming. All right. Then we get this genealogy, this epilogue, the ancestry of the royal line. Notice what it does. It gives you 10 generations. Now, these are the generations of Perez, right? Perez is from Judah, right? Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. This is the only place where we can find a genealogy at the end of a book. And it's an intentionally put at the end of the book. Who's it driving you to? King David. It's 10 generations. There's two other genealogies that are significant in the Bible that are 10 generations listed together. Genesis chapter 5, the pre-diluvian, if you will, or pre-flood people, okay, are listed there. 10 generations in Genesis chapter 5. And then Genesis chapter 11, Abraham's family line, down to Abraham. Post-flood genealogy of that family to Abraham, 10 generations. Now you go from Perez, the son of Judah, to David. In other words, what does the pre-diluvian or pre-flood family lineage lay out for us? How you get to Noah and the coming of this redemption promised in Genesis 3:15, right? So with Noah, then what does the 10 generations of Abraham's family in Genesis 11 point us to? Because it ends with Abram. What is it pointing us to? how we continue this redemptive story to Abram, right? Who is going to bring us land, seed, and blessing, whose son, his seed, will ultimately bless the nations. You guys follow me on that? Now you have 10 generations again. What's it driving you to? David. So 10 generations drove you to Noah, 10 generations drove you to Abraham, now 10 generations driving you to David. All of these quite significant in the history of man and in the history of Israel and in the history of the coming of the Messiah. By the way, this language is picked up in this genealogy here in Matthew 1 as well, isn't it? All right. Here's the thing. The king Israel needs is coming. That's what Ruth is driving you at. The king that Israel needs, he's coming. He's David. He's coming from these two worthy people in the nation of moral and spiritual apostasy. And the Lord has been at work. By the way, check this out. Even through the sin of Elimelech's family, to bring his Redeemer. To bring the king. You guys follow that? How does this tie to the story that brings us to the New Testament of the Messiah? Because it ties to the story that brings us to David, who is the son, David, who is the father of the Messiah, if you will. You say, well, he's not the immediate father, but you understand in that kind of language, right? King David is bringing us to him and the covenant God will make with him. It's bringing us to Samuel, which the book of Samuel is really about this king who comes to Israel, right? David. This king they've been waiting for, this king they need, he's coming. A king who is a man after God's own heart, not one who does whatever is right in his own eyes. Now, Israel first, when we get to Samuel, you're going to find is going to pick a king who does what is right in his own eyes. Because that's the kind of people they are. It's the kind of king they want. But that's not the kind of king they should have desired. They should have desired the king after the pattern of the king they're told by Moses they should desire. One who does what is right in the eyes of the Lord. Right? All right. Now there's other ways we can tie kinsman redeemer to Christ, obviously. Paying this bride price and buying a people, etc., etc. I'm not going to do that this morning, though. We'll get further into that later. Any questions we have? Next week we'll pick up at Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel I'm going to take as one book. Samuel. They weren't originally split. We've split them to 1st, 2nd Samuel. Not we recently. It happened a long time ago. But it was originally just Samuel. So we'll go there next. Any questions at this point? Yes, sir.
So we would probably date the author's in David's time and probably after David and move on to David, right? Do you know the time between this story and Abraham?
Between the story and the reign of David, when this actually happened, well, I mean, from Obed to David, so whatever, the birth of Obed is here. I would have to look in Samuel to see how far along Obed and then Jesse are before David is born and reigns. But, I mean, 2 generations, the difference between a grandson and a grandfather. But I don't remember how many years exactly that is. But, yeah, I mean, roughly the gap between D and your kids, right? Roughly that long, but yeah. So that's roughly the period. But I mean, if you go, when is the book written? Some will argue that it's written in the exilic period. So to remind Israel. But it's clearly written after David, because David's listed in it. Okay, so I mean, none of these books give us a date. So scholars will argue about that when it was exactly written. But it's clearly not written during the period that this happens, because it's referencing the grandson of Naomi's grandson, right? And it's telling us that in a way that we know he's significant. We know he's significant. We know who David is. So it's not like it's telling us this before anybody knows who David is. It's telling it to you after you already know who David is. All right. Yes, sir.
There's laws about, no Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord and stuff like that. And obviously, the first 2,000
Yeah, that's a super important question, and I forgot to come to that point because I kept emphasizing she's a foreigner. There's a definite emphasis here that Abraham's seed, Abraham's offspring, is going to be a blessing to the nations, isn't there? In other words, remember, you have land, seed, and blessing, but the blessing is to all the nations. We haven't seen Israel be a blessing to the nations yet. But this emphasis is, here's Boaz from the tribe of Judah, an Israelite, who is blessing a foreigner. He actively blesses her, right? He not only says blessings to her, he blesses her with food, and then he blesses her by redeeming her. Is there any requirement in the covenant, by the way, in the Old Covenant, to redeem a Gentile woman? No. Okay? So Boaz steps up as the kinsman redeemer of this Gentile woman. They could have claimed, hey, I can buy that land. I don't have to take that Moabite. Right? But he doesn't. He's going to buy the land and redeem her. And there's this definite pointing at in Ruth, the fact that the seed of Abraham's not only going to bless Israel, is going to bless the nations. And Ruth becomes part of the genealogy of the Christ, right? When you get to Matthew, Ruth is listed in Christ's genealogy. More than one Gentile woman is listed in Christ's genealogy. Rahab is listed, also a Gentile woman, right? Who was a prostitute even, right? But both of these women turn to the Lord. Answer your question, they both come to Yahweh in faith. You see it in Rahab's confession. She believes in the Lord. He's the God of heaven and earth. He's the God who delivered you from Egypt. He's the God who's going to deliver us into your hands, kind of thing, right? Rahab confesses faith in the Lord, and so does Ruth. And it causes us to slow down and be careful to think that you're only included in Israel by genealogical descent. Because it's just not true. You could come into Israel as a foreigner through faith in Yahweh. Right? You see it here. And even there will be Gentiles in the family line. But the point is, the blessing is coming to the nations through this king who's coming. Right? And it's driving us at that. That's why this all gets picked up. After you read this kind of thing, you should go read Matthew 1 and just notice the importance of picking up. You have a genealogy of men. How often do women appear in genealogies? Okay? Not very often, but in Jesus's they do. Just picking up on these themes. Ruth appears there, Rahab appears there. Bathsheba appears there. Right? In other words, David's own sin is highlighted in the genealogy of the Christ, right? Because it says David bore a son through Bathsheba by the wife of Uriah, who's dead. In other words, he kills Uriah and takes Bathsheba and bears a son. That's in the genealogy of the Christ. There's a prostitute in the genealogy of the Christ. There's a foreigner Moabite woman. A Moabite woman. Moabites came from the incestual relationship of Lot, who cursed Israel, who tried to use their women to convert them to false gods. There's a Moabite woman in the genealogy of Christ. That stuff is significant. So we read genealogies and we get bored because we don't know the historical ties that are being pointed out there and the importance of it. All right. Let me pray. Father, thank you for this morning. Thank you for the book of Ruth and your continued faithful testimony throughout Scripture. The fact that you are going to fulfill your promise to Abraham, your promise of land and seed and blessing to all nations. We're thankful that we've seen the promise of land fulfilled to them in Joshua most specifically, and of seed from Exodus forward, Father, and that we're seeing even the beginning of Abraham's seed being a blessing to all nations in Boaz redeeming Ruth, and in the King David coming from that marriage. We're thankful that you have relentlessly pursued to save your people, even working through our sin to bring about your saving purposes for our sake. Pray that we would give great thanks. In Jesus' name, amen.